Good afternoon, this is your captain speaking.
All right, thank you, Suzanne Caldeira, for coming on for another episode of Tuesday's Tips. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about sellers and buyers. I'm going to start off and say, from an agent who primarily does listings, I want to talk to sellers out there about not letting a good buyer go when they've put in a good, solid offer that matches what the comparable sales say. For example, we recently had a buyer come forward on a listing. It was toward the end of the week, and the listing had been up for a bit, so it wasn't a new listing. You know, those can have slightly different scenarios that we'll work through. So on this listing that had been up for a little while, we negotiated a very fair offer on, let's say, a Thursday night. We had about come to terms, but we had a showing the next day. We decided to hold off till after the showing. The buyer kind of ghosted us, and we really should have immediately gone back to the seller, but we decided to wait the weekend. And towards the end of the weekend, when nothing materialized from that showing, went back to a very well-qualified buyer. And this is where Suzanne's going to come in a minute. They decided, and this is on a buyer that was well-qualified and was under a time crunch, moving from Texas up here. The agent came back and said, I'm sorry, they found another house. They've already offered on it, and we're moving forward with that. So we lost a very good buyer because we were looking for something a little bit sweeter, an offer a little bit better, the grass a little bit greener. And sometimes it's just not worth it, especially when you're talking $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, you know, is kind of the price points that we're talking about here today, or any price point really. But, you know, there tends to be a few less buyers up in that price range here in the tri-state area, Rhode Island, Mass, Connecticut. So when I say a well-qualified buyer, could mean a couple of things. Suzanne, why don't you give us a couple of options and some details as to what it means to be a well-qualified buyer? Do they just call you up and say, hey, can you send me a letter? I make $200,000 a year, and you give it to them, or is there a little more involved?
I usually ask if they can fog a mirror. Then I give them the letter.
Welcome back to 2006. No, never mind.
Woohoo! We're gonna make money. No, in all seriousness, especially like when you mention those markets, Jeremy, in Massachusetts, for instance, most pre-approvals in certain areas were not getting accepted last year unless they were a full commitment, unless the person could waive the mortgage contingency. So we have what's known as our power bid approval. That means the person's gone completely through underwriting. We typically get those done within about 24 to 48 hours of receipt of all of the client's documents. And that means that's as good as cash that they can compete with a cash offer. So if you see something like that, like for instance, if you're on the listing side and you see, oh, okay, it's power bid from guaranteed rate, this is as good as cash. And, you know, I think from a seller's perspective, hey, if it's a couple of thousand extra that you're trying to get, or even if it's 10,000 extra, in the whole scheme of things, as the market has shifted, you may not get another buyer. And a buyer that's on a time crunch, when you make that buyer wait, that buyer might start having doubts, or that buyer might say to their buyer agent, hey, is there another property that we can look at? So, you know, I think it's looking at like, hey, is it an upfront mortgage commitment, or is it just a pre-approval? Just a pre-approval means that it's my eyes, it's my vetting, it's my experience, it's my name on the line. Hasn't gone through underwriting. I'm not perfect. You know, I might get maybe 1 to 3 denials a year. As of last year in 2022, I didn't have any denials on any income that I had done. But I will tell you, on some of my pre-approvals, sometimes things came up, and we had to figure out, how do we fix this to be able to get us to the closing table? So in an extremely competitive market, there's a big difference between commitment versus big difference between pre-approval. So
awesome. Thank you
for clarify that.
Yeah, thank you for, I'm going to break it down a little bit and then maybe
Yeah.
you will want to add on a little bit more. So
Certainly.
primarily as a listing agent, when we see offers come in, generally they have the pre-approval letter. Some lenders issue them a little more willy-nilly than others. Suzanne is not one of those. So when I see that, I'll generally have to call the agent. Even if I know them, I'll call the agent and discuss things a little bit. But when I see a pre-approval from someone like Suzanne, I know they've drilled down. You know, they've gathered tons of documents, taxes, pay stubs, uh, lots of other stuff. You know, verified income. You know, all sorts of stuff like that, and that's good and that's average. In many times we'll accept an offer like that, you know, and we work towards, as part of the purchase and sales contract, the commitment, the loan commitment. And that's the second piece that you were talking about, where you're one of the few lenders or only lenders, I've never really dealt with that before, except with guaranteed rate, where you can actually get a pre-commitment for someone and all you have to do is plug in the property. So that, and normally the commitment deadline in a purchase and sales contract is as late as 2 weeks before the closing date. So if someone comes to me and says, hey, we're pre-approved and we are pre-committed, we have the commitment letter, that means that contingency you can waive that contingency in your offer. One, it's going to make your offer much stronger. And two, it's going to give the seller more peace of mind to maybe your offer is very close, the same, maybe not quite as good as another offer dollar-wise or terms-wise, but when they see that, they're like, hey, you know what? This is much less risk. This is well worth it to accept the 0.5% less, you know, on an offer price or something like that. So that's a
Absolutely.
big deal. Both the pre-approval and the commitment that both can come from Suzanne Caldeira.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely been something that has helped a lot of people get offers accepted, has helped them compete with cash. So, you know, a lender that, you know, doesn't have the ability to do an upfront commitment on your end, Jeremy, I just would recommend, you know, that you grill them. Like, I don't mind when I get grilled. If an agent calls me, if we haven't worked together, or even if we have, I don't care. You know what? Put me on the stand, grill me. That's your job. You're working for your seller, and I'm not going to take offense at that. We want to, obviously, we want to make certain that that you're doing your job for your client. So I never take offense at getting grilled.
Awesome, and thanks for bringing that up, because many times, especially if I don't know the lender, said, listen, don't take offense to this. I'm going to assume that you didn't do your job. And I'm going to start drilling down, and I want you to sell me that you've really done the work on this pre-approval, because I don't want to get halfway through this process and get 3 or 4 weeks down the road to get a denial letter, be like, you know what? You didn't do your job. And I'm only saying this because as listing agents, and I know you've grabbed buyers before that were previously denied and you helped them get pre-approved. The last thing we want is to get a denial when you're halfway through the sales process. It's devastating for all involved.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with you and I. It has to do with all the parties involved. You've got families on the line. You've got people that, you know, they've got movers, they've got this, they've got all this stuff going on that, you know, and if it's a domino, which, you know, you might want to explain what a domino is.
Yeah. So, you know, we'll do that on another, we can talk about that and we'll drill down on that. So for today, let's just summarize with a few bullet points. Sellers, the grass isn't always greener. If you have the other 2 bullet points and you have a well-qualified buyer that's either has a solid pre-approval or even better, a rock-solid, rock-star pre-commitment from Guaranteed Rate. And that's it in a nutshell today.
Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Tuesday's Tips. I'm Jeremy Bailey, your flying realtor. Remember to keep your wings level, and I gotta fly.